Hi, everyone. This is Lisa Roberts. I'm the Executive Director of the Florida Wildfire Foundation, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon. In case you're new to our organization, we protect, connect, and expand native wildfire habitats throughout the state through research, education, planting, and conservation. You can find out more about us at www.flawildflowers.org. This is brought to you by the State Wildfire License Plate. And whether you have this old look or the new one, you're funding research, education, and planting projects statewide. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. All attendees are muted with their cameras off throughout the webinar. The webinar is being recorded. It will be available about 24 hours from now on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/FLA Wildflowers, and it will be on our website, flawildflowers.org. You can submit questions during the webinar through the Q&A feature at any point. We will be answering them at the end of the presentation as time permits. And if your question isn't answered, you can email it to info@flawildflowers.org, and we will get it to Emily and get you a response. So I'm really pleased to introduce to you Emily Roberson. She's the director of the Native Plant Society of the United States, formerly the Native Plant Conservation Campaign, which is a network of more than 60 native plant societies, botanical gardens, and other native plant conservation organizations, including ours. Previously, Dr. Roberson was a senior policy analyst for the California Native Plant Society for 11 years. She then directed the campaign as a project of the Center for Biological Diversity before launching it as an independent organization. She has a bachelor's degree in plant ecology from Harvard University and a PhD in soil microbial ecology from UC Berkeley. So welcome, Emily. I'm going to stop my share and we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay. So is everybody seeing this first slide?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Florida Wildflower Foundation, for giving me the opportunity to develop and present this webinar, which also gave me an opportunity to learn all about lawns. And that turned out to be rather horrific, as you're going to see as you listen to this talk. So there's good news at the end of it, though. So it'll be a little bit depressing in the beginning, but there are lots of good developments in this area that we're going to tell you about at the end. So now I'm going to play the talk, and thank you again for this opportunity. We're going to talk today about lawns, and I know that most of you are probably very well aware of the many environmental problems that are associated with lawns. But we're going to briefly this afternoon go over some of those problems, present some data that shows what it turns out, at least to me, is the very surprisingly large size and scope of the environmental problems that are caused by lawns. Then we'll talk about what is really good news, the growing movement to replace lawns with other kinds of landscaping, particularly native-dominated landscaping. And I hope that all of this will provide some ideas on how we can all advocate for that movement to replace lawns with more environmental friendly landscaping, particularly, as I said, dominated by locally adapted native plants. But before we start talking about lawns, I just want to give you a little background on the Native Plant Society of the United States. We've been around in one form or another for about 20 years. We've been around in our current incarnation as an independent 501c3 nonprofit since 2015. We're a national network of affiliate native plant societies, botanic gardens, wildflower clubs, and other native plant science and conservation organizations. We've got at least one affiliate in almost all of the 50 states right now. And we estimate, really with very little basis in fact or evidence, but we estimate and say that we represent upwards of 500,000 native plant enthusiasts around the United States. The goals of the Native Plant Society of the United States are pretty much exactly what anybody would expect them to be. We work to bring together all the disparate native plant societies and botanic gardens and other organizations into a united national collaborative, cooperative voice and constituency, loud voice and constituency for native plant science and conservation in this country, and to strengthen our message for native plant conservation and actions for native plant conservation at the local, state, and federal levels. We use that united voice, among other things, to fight what we're calling plant invisibility these days. It used to be called plant blindness. Most of you are probably familiar with the concept. Some of the disabled community have objected to our use of the term blindness for this because it's pejorative. So we're trying plant invisibility as a workaround, and believe me, we're open to alternative suggestions if you've got any ideas. So we work to fight plant invisibility, and we also use that united voice to fight a symptom of plant invisibility, which is the very, very large need we have to support and defend the individuals and organizations and agencies in this country that carry out the important work of native plant science and conservation. One of the things I wanted to point out here is that the Native Plant Society of the United States implements the global strategy for plant conservation. So we're the affiliates of the Native Plant Society of the United States, formerly the Native Plant Conservation Campaign. Clearly, I need to change this slide. Are not only part of a national movement for plant conservation, we're working with international partners as part of an international movement to conserve and restore native plant communities around the world. So this is a we are not alone kind of reminder here. We have to work to fight plant invisibility because the problem with plant invisibility, of course, is that it's, well, maybe not of course, but that it's so widespread, and in particular, it's widespread among decision makers, elected officials, the media, and other people and organizations that play a very important role in allocating funding, staffing, support in creating conservation laws, in making decisions about how much attention and resources native plant conservation is going to be. And because all of these people, and one of the worst aspects of this, and kind of surprising, is that plant invisibility also is surprisingly widespread, although this is getting better, but surprisingly widespread among the broader conservation community, among the big, powerful organizations that tend to be, at least traditionally, focused on conserving animals, charismatic megafauna in particular, bears, wolves, whales, and so on. And because of this pervasive problem of people not understanding how important plants are in supporting wildlife, and let alone supporting life on Earth, which we'll talk about in a minute, we end up with a very bad situation out on the ground, which is that we have a two-tier conservation system in the United States and really around the world. This whole problem is not confined to the United States. And this is just an example of this two-tier system in dollar terms. And what it means is that plants across the board, local, state, federal levels, laws, budgets, everything, receive a fraction of the attention, of the staff, of the budgets, of the hours of conservation work that is allocated to wildlife. And that, of course, is a very big problem because you cannot effectively conserve ecosystems, let alone the wildlife that depend on those ecosystems, without conserving and restoring the native plant species and communities that are the foundations of those ecosystems. So if you don't have people that know what they're doing and are doing it out there on the ground to conserve the plants, the whole rest of the enterprise is much less likely to be successful, and that's an enormous problem. It's also a problem because without sufficient funding and staffing and expertise to conserve and restore native plant communities successfully, you can't conserve and restore ecosystems successfully, not to mention the wildlife that inhabit them. And that also puts at risk the supply of the essential ecosystem services that healthy, diverse native plant communities and ecosystems provide. This is one of the ways in which we reach out to people afflicted with plant invisibility, is to explain to them the many invaluable ecosystem services that healthy native plant communities provide, and basically explain to them that it's in their self-interest to conserve these plants and ecosystems so that the supply of services remains stable and resilient, and let them know that native plants, while they are beautiful and they do provide wildlife habitat, they are also essential to the health, functioning, resilience, prosperity of human societies and economies. Again, it's in our own self-interest, irrespective of the effects on the beauty of the landscape or wildlife, to conserve the plant communities that provide these services. And these are very important services and becoming more and more important as we face the crises, the extinction crisis, the climate crisis, and all of the bad environmental problems that are going along with those that are threatening the health and prosperity and resilience and functioning of human societies and economies, not to mention all life on Earth. So native plant communities, of course, provide habitat. They also really effectively store and purify our water supply. They help keep the air clean and healthy. They buffer this function. This function is becoming ever more important with climate change, extreme weather, all kinds of extreme weather. We'll talk about that more. They support in many ways the security and quality of not just our water supply, but also our food supply. And in many ways, they also support the health of humans. And we'll talk about that later too. And finally, of course, they directly fight climate change by sequestering carbon. And we need these ecosystem services right now more than ever, because we're losing them to the climate and the extinction crisis and all of the associated ills. We've got wildfires, we've got droughts, we've got floods, we've got famine, we've got disease among humans and also many, many other species. We've got life-threatening heat waves all over the place, and pollution is continuing to accelerate. So we need all the help we can get, and one way to get there is to conserve and restore native plant communities and the ecosystem services that will help buffer and possibly even start to reverse many of these problems. So where do lawns come into all of this? Well, they aren't helping. First of all, they, of course, don't produce any ecosystem services whatsoever, which is bad enough. So they're taking away the positive things that native plant communities do for us. And in addition, they also contribute negatively to the health of humans and the environment and wildlife. So lawns obviously require lots of inputs. They produce lots of bad outputs in terms of pollution. They exacerbate climate change. We're going to talk in more detail, as I said briefly, about all of these. They aggravate some of the problems produced by climate change, such as flooding. They destroy not just wildlife habitat, but wildlife itself. And on top of all of that, they're really expensive and they're no fun. And getting to the surprising size and scope of the problems associated with lawns, at least to me, I've never had a lawn, so perhaps this is not as big of a surprise to many as it was to me, but it turns out that lawns are everywhere. Non-native turf is the single largest irrigated crop in the United States, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. A 2005 NASA study found 63,000 square miles of lawn in the United States. And because these data are so old, these numbers may be low. And lawns dominate huge swaths of the landscape in many states, which means that the problems that they produce are correspondingly large. So here are some numbers to support that. Lawns consume up to 3 trillion gallons of water per year. In urban areas, up to 60% of the fresh water supply is used for lawn irrigation, which is a problem because with climate change and all of the stuff that comes along with it, and including drought, but also floods and pollution, our water supply is less stable, less resilient than it ever has been. And on top of all of that, up to somewhere between 500 million and 1 trillion gallons of gas are used every year just by lawnmowers, not by leaf blowers, not by lawn aerators, not by any of the other equipment that lawns seem to require, just lawnmowers alone. And obviously that's not going to do anything good for either pollution or climate change. And here are some data showing that. So a single lawnmower can produce the same level of emissions as 40 driving cars. These are still EPA data. Lawns consume up to 80 million pounds a year of pesticides. Lawns consume up to 90 million pounds per year of fertilizer. And just filling lawnmowers alone spills up to 17 million gallons of gas per year, which I thought was absurd until my husband explained to me that when he was mowing lawns as a teenager, spilling gas while filling up the lawnmowers was a major feature of his job. So needless to say, none of this does anything good for climate change. We're talking about 90 million pounds a year of fertilizer. Well, every one of those pounds of fertilizer produces 2 pounds of carbon dioxide. A lot of people over-fertilize and over-pesticide their lawns, so you get decomposition of nitrogen fertilizer, which leads to the production of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, but including things like nitrous oxide that are more potent greenhouse gases than CO2. Lawnmowers emit up to 40 billion pounds per year of CO2. Lawn clippings, and we'll talk more about that too, in landfills decompose and also produce greenhouse gases, not just CO2, but also things like methane, which again are more potent greenhouse gases. I've included a couple of, sort of case studies here. A Florida study found that a 10-acre parcel dominated by lawn emitted 11 pounds of CO2 per year, plus nitrous. And a Tennessee study found that a 2.5-acre lawn produced upwards of 2,000 kilograms of CO2 per year. Another problem that is accelerating and expanding with climate change is problems with urban stormwater management, with increasingly strong storms, with us paving over the landscape everywhere. We've got much more urban and suburban severe flooding and associated pollution than we used to. And lawns aren't helping there either. Lawns, it turns out, absorb only about 10% of the storm water compared to what a natural native plant-dominated landscape would absorb. One of the reasons for this is that turf grass roots are very, very shallow compared to native grasses and other native plants, which tend to have deeper root systems. And those deep root systems perform all sorts of terrific functions, including increasing infiltration into the soil, directly absorbing water, and both of these things reduce flood risk and contribute to drought and climate resilience. And to top that off, on the pollution side, a Chesapeake Bay study found that up to 56% of the pollution in streams feeding the bay came from lawn fertilizer, and also included the cheery information that lawns are now the largest crop in Maryland. And here's that whole root system concept presented graphically. This is a vast overgeneralization, but it does show you the idea that native grasses and other native plant root systems are deeper, more robust, more complex, stronger than non-native plants, and that turf grass is the worst offender of all with its extremely shallow root systems. And these deep and complex root systems, like I said, do all sorts of good things. They hold the soil in place to help reduce erosion risk. They facilitate infiltration that helps stop flooding, but also helps with the recharge of groundwater aquifers. They absorb water directly, which of course helps with drought resilience and climate resilience, but also stops it from turning into surface floodwaters. They also remove pollutants and sediment. They absorb pollutants and they filter sediment from both surface and below ground flows of water during storms. So deep, robust root systems are our friends. With climate change and paving everything, more and more cities are faced with basically overburdened stormwater management infrastructure. And in Philadelphia is an example of a city that is doing what I hope will become a trend. It is in fact becoming a trend of addressing their stormwater management problems with plants in general and native plants in particular. They were having a few years back terrible problems with their stormwater system, their traditional stormwater system being completely overrun by increasingly severe floods. They looked at expanding that system or upgrading it with traditional methods, concrete-based methods, which would mean bigger pipes, bigger and more catch basins, and other traditional methods of water management. And they found that the bill to do that, to stop the stormwater system from being overwhelmed, was something like $10 billion. And they had to do it because they were getting, as the stormwater system was overwhelmed, they were getting overspills, sewage spills, raw sewage was being spilled into creeks and into streets. And so they entered into an agreement with the Environmental Protection Agency to improve their water quality by upgrading their stormwater infrastructure. And they looked at the kinds of concepts we've been talking about and decided to approach it with a different method than the traditional concrete-based approach, which is to use, like I said, plants. So they embarked on a program to create what they call a green mosaic of stormwater infrastructure, which means daylighting streams that had been paved over, restoring and expanding riparian areas, restoring and expanding wetlands, creating plant-dominated rather than concrete-dominated areas to catch floodwaters, using streams instead of pipes to channel floodwaters away from sensitive areas. And the bill for that approach, they estimated, was only about $3 billion. So that this is one of the arguments you can use with elected officials and others who may not be interested in plants for their own sake, but may be interested in saving their constituents, taxpayers, billions of dollars and preventing or reducing flood danger. So, of course, lawns also cause problems for wildlife. Lawns replace the native plants that provide food and habitat for wildlife, so they remove necessary food sources and habitat. And as if that's not bad enough, lawn chemicals also directly kill wildlife, including beneficial organisms that do things like support the food web that supports all the wildlife, songbirds, and others, as we'll talk about, the organisms that help pollinate wild and crop plants, and that's becoming more and more important to support those organisms as our non-native honeybee pollinators are having terrible problems, as you know. And they kill other beneficial organisms that provide natural pest control, birds, bats, spiders, and so on. Globally, natural pest control, as opposed to chemical pest control, is worth at least $100 billion, according to UN estimates. And as if that's not bad enough, the EPA tells us that most of the wildlife poisonings that get reported to them are associated with lawn chemicals. So it's not good. Here's an example of a great study that shows this by very good friend to the Native Plant Society of the United States, Doug Tallamy, who I know you guys know, and his grad student, Desiree Narango. And you may have seen this study already, but I put it in here anyway because it's, as far as I know, certainly the first and maybe the only sort of quantitative study of the relationship between native plants or non-native plants and wildlife survival. So Dr. Tallamy and his grad students looked at yards around the Washington, D.C. area and compared breeding success of Carolina chickadee in yards dominated by introduced plants versus those dominated by natives. And not surprisingly, the introduced plants performed very poorly in supporting the songbird population. Non-native dominated yards produced fewer caterpillars that are essential food source for the birds, and that sort of cascaded through so that they had less breeding success, didn't create as many eggs, died, and other bad outcomes. And in fact, they estimated that a yard needed by biomass 70% or more native plants to sustainably support chickadee populations. If you went below 70% native plants, the breeding success meant that the population level would not be stable, and because their breeding success they wouldn't be successful in breeding. And you can see here the negative relationship between non-native plant presence and reproductive success in this bird. Now, all of those things that I've talked about, I think, make very much common sense, and probably you guys were aware of, although if you're like me, not aware of the vast quantities of bad things that lawns promote. But when I was putting this presentation together, turns out that noise pollution, which I hadn't even thought about, is also a bad side effect of lawns. Lawnmowers, leaf blowers, and other machines that again, lawns seem to require, produce lots of loud noises, and sounds louder than 85 decibels are bad for people, particularly children that tend to be more sensitive to every kind of stress. And mowers produce up to 90 decibels of sound, and leaf blowers aren't that much better. And these sounds also harm our wildlife population because wildlife, of course, use sound to find mates, to find food, to avoid predators, to survive. And loud noises obviously disrupt these functions. There aren't very many studies of this yet, but loud noises have been found to harm birds' breeding success, the health of insect populations, which of course birds and the whole food web rely on for sustenance, And loud noise is being increasingly recognized as a threat not just to humans, but also to wildlife. So we see that lawns are very, very, very bad for people and the planet, yet somehow, for some reason, we both work hard and pay dearly for the privilege of having them. Um, in the United States, we spend somewhere between 30 and $60 billion a year on lawn care, chemicals, fertilizer, pesticide, lawn cutting, and all of the other things that are needed to maintain lawns. And apparently, we spend upwards of 3 million hours per year on lawnmowers. And all of this is not good, not just for wildlife, but also for people. So you're saying now, well, my goodness, lawns certainly are bad and cause many, many environmental problems and aren't very good for people either. I wonder if there's an alternative out there that's eco-friendly and cost-effective that's just waiting to be deployed. It will come as no surprise. So, of course, for many years, native plant societies and like-minded organizations have been working with landowners to try to get them to plant native plant gardens and replace their lawns. Um, and people have, in recent years, started studying the many, many benefits that come from doing exactly that. So native dominated gardens, not surprisingly, require less water and less work and produce less waste. So in LA, they tested a native dominated garden versus a traditional garden that was dominated by lawn. And the native gardens used 83% less water, required 70% less maintenance, and produced 56% less yard waste. And yard waste turns out to make up to 50% of the burden in US landfills, which is also a big deal because US landfills are also becoming very much overburdened and are becoming an enormous problem for municipalities throughout the United States. And natives cost less too, not surprisingly again. Our colleagues at the Xerces Society were trying to persuade, I think, the Department of Transportation in Maryland to stop maintaining conventional lawns alongside roadsides and replace them with native meadows. And they estimated that that would save the state of Maryland or municipalities or anybody who made the switch up to $5,000 per acre per year in switching from lawns to natives. In a more anecdotal example, these studies are just starting to be done comparing the costs. So anecdotal data is what's available. A Missouri business switched from its conventional non-native dominated landscaping, which cost $19,000 per acre per year for mowing and trimming and mulching and fertilizing and reseeding and replacement, not to mention design and so on. They replaced that with a native prairie, which ended up saving them something like $15,000 per acre per year. Again, these are the kinds of figures that may be of interest to elected officials and others who may want to save their constituents some money on roadside maintenance. So, lawns suck. They suck water, labor, money, our health, our safety. They suck away our quiet, wildlife habitat, suck our air and water quality away from us, and of course, they suck away our climate resilience. But there is progress. Because of these overwhelming data showing the problems with lawns, the movement to replace lawns with natives is growing rapidly. And more organizations, not just native plant societies, but other environmental organizations, are providing programs to help people switch their gardens over to native-dominated gardens. But it's not just us in the native plant and environmental communities anymore. In the past just couple of years, this has kind of careened into this concept has kind of penetrated the mainstream media, so that these are all stories, and this is just a fraction of the ones I found, sort of attacking lawns and advocating replacing them with cheaper, more environmentally friendly, native-dominated landscaping. So these ideas are being heard outside of the traditional environmental community, and that's a very hopeful bit of progress. And governments are listening. Minnesota, for example, has a cost share program that encourages people to replace lawns with native prairie. Other states are doing the same thing, particularly in the West, particularly now that our drought in the West is becoming so unbelievably horrific. States are starting to pay more and more to landowners to replace their lawns and landscaping with drought tolerant and environmentally friendly native dominated landscaping. And of course, we're hoping that this will work and be used as a model by other states and municipalities. In fact, Utah at least is considering implementing something along these lines in the near future. Another important development that just happened this year is on the Homeowners Association front. I'm sure you're aware that homeowners associations are one of the biggest barriers to lawn conversion that we face. And in Maryland, a homeowner had put in a butterfly and pollinator garden. She fell afoul of her homeowners association and her neighbors, who actually spent $100,000, the HOA did, to persuade her through lawyers and other means to get rid of her butterfly garden and return it to a lawn. And this did not have the desired effect. And she continued to defend her lawn. And the outcome was that Maryland, just this year, the Senate unanimously passed, and the House also passed, a law that actually prohibits homeowners associations from requiring lawns and prohibits homeowners associations from banning native and other environmentally friendly gardens. And this is a very important development because there are 370,000 homeowners associations in the United States. So we hope that with the drought and climate change, that other states and municipalities will look at this law and help the homeowners associations let people off the leash and let them create environmentally friendly, water-saving, non-polluting landscaping. And you can read all about this in a lovely article called Butterflies 1, Bullies 0. And you can also find that in the archives of the NPCC News on our website. But you can also just search for Butterflies 1, Bullies 0, and the article by the woman's sister should come up. So all of this progress means that we're getting more and more organizations and institutions, as well as state and local governments, looking at initiatives and other ways to replace lawns with natives. And again, friend of the Native Plant Society of the United States, Doug Tallamy, has just this year proposed a new initiative that he calls the Homegrown National Park. And you can read all about it online at homegrownnationalpark.org. And the idea is that since more than 85% of the United States east of the Mississippi is privately owned, if we only replant, Doug says, half of the area now in private lawns, which is 20 million acres, we get a homegrown national park, which is bigger than the area. And these slides are courtesy of Dr. Talamy, of all these national parks combined. In addition, there are many other places where we can promote these initiatives on sort of semi-private, semi-public landscapes like rights of way, golf courses, airports, and so on. And if you look at all of these places that are now dominated by lawns and or weeds, or generally non-functioning plant communities, it's almost 600 million acres. And so the idea is to start working with these landowners and land managers to conserve and restore native plant communities on these 600 million acres. And some of the landowners are already starting to do it. Some power companies are managing their rights of way for native plants and wildlife, for example. So I think I've shown what's wrong with lawns. And what I want to talk about to end this is how replacing them with native plant communities helps provide those ecosystem services that we talked about at the beginning. Native plant communities provide ecosystem services that help with resilience of the quantity and quality of our food supply, as well as water supply, obviously habitat. They buffer extreme weather, which we're having increasing problems with now. They help fight climate change and air pollution, improving both air and water quality. They support our public health, which we'll talk about, and even contribute to disaster resilience, which, of course, with increasing disasters is a increasing. It turns out that native plant communities promote improved immune system health in children. This study is from New Zealand from a few years back, but similar studies are producing similar findings all over the world. So in New Zealand, they had a public health database that included 50,000 children, and they used satellite data and other indices to try to come up with an index of what they call, the authors, the researchers called greenness, which is the presence of diverse native plant communities in the areas where these kids were growing up. And what they found was that growing up among diverse native plant communities led to significantly lower asthma rates in children. And on the flip side, children growing up among less diverse and or non-native dominated plant communities had higher childhood asthma rates. And they attribute this to what's called the biodiversity hypothesis, which is another one of these things that we should feature in our going forward in our arguments for conservation and restoration of native plant communities. And here's how it works. The idea is that diverse native plant communities naturally provide habitat for diverse communities of microorganisms. And kids growing up among diverse communities of microorganisms develop more robust immune systems and so are less likely to succumb to immune-related problems like asthma. And as I said, many more studies are coming out from all over the world using different methods to test this same hypothesis with native plants and are producing the same findings. Another example of an ecosystem service that's provided by native plant communities that you've probably already heard of, but bears repeating, is the New York City water supply. They, like Philadelphia, ran into problems back in the 90s with water quality in New York City. And they too looked at either expanding or constructing a new water treatment plant, which the bill for which would have been about $10 billion plus annual maintenance. They instead, what they did was through easements and purchase, buy and protect and restore the native plant communities around the watersheds that provided the water for New York City, and to take advantage of the water purification services provided by native plant communities, and particularly those deep, robust root systems, which we talked about. And it worked. They came into compliance on water quality, and apparently New York City water is exceptionally flavorful. I don't know, but the results have been apparently spectacular. So those are just a couple of examples of ecosystem services providing cost-effective solutions to all kinds of problems, from stormwater management to water purification to public health. And there are many more examples, and we put together a series of pages on our website about ecosystem services and nature-based solutions to environmental problems associated with conserving and restoring native plant communities and the services they provide. And you'll find all sorts of data and diagrams and journal articles and case studies and other things that we hope will make it easier and more effective for people to argue in favor of conservation and restoration of native plant communities to those people in the media or among our elected officials who, again, may not care anything about open space, native plants, wildlife, natural areas, but do. So we hope all of this information will help encourage people to take action to promote programs like Native Plant Society, Native Plant Garden programs, or the Homegrown National Park, or whatever. I hope that people will join their Native Plant Society and local botanic garden, because it's important to remember that Native Plant Societies and botanic gardens are the best source of information on what actually is a locally appropriate native plant species. And these organizations also tend to keep information on what native plant nurseries are doing a good job of producing and selling high quality, reliable, locally adapted plants. And we hope people will go out and ask their elected officials to encourage programs and laws like the New Jersey roadside law, which requires native plants along roadsides in New Jersey following Hurricane Sandy, and others. And our website soon will have a page showing all the state and local laws around the country that are promoting or requiring the use of native plants in gardens along roadsides and so on. And again, to repeat this yet again, people that don't care about plants or wildlife may still want to save their taxpayers, their constituents, billions on stormwater infrastructure or water purification infrastructure, promote public health in their local communities, save taxpayers millions of dollars in maintenance of roadside turf, and so on. So you don't have to even mention that native plants are pretty anymore. This is an example of what happens when you have to develop a presentation during COVID. I apologize, and thank you very much for listening. And I think now we're going to questions. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you, Emily. That was a massive amount of information, and we have a couple of folks who would like to know if you have citations to go with that, a list of citations and a list of the studies that you used in the presentation, so they can, glean the same sort of information and take it locally, to decision makers.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, we don't put anything up unless it's at least peer reviewed, or if it's an anecdote, like I said, we cite it as such. All of these studies will be on the ecosystem services pages of our website at plantsocieties.org. If you click on ecosystem services, I can also put together a list of links to the ones specifically used today. but there's a lot more there. For example, the New Zealand asthma study, if you want corroborating studies, they're online in the public health section of the ecosystem services thing. But I'll put together the ecosystem services section of the website. There's a public health section, there's a food resilience section, there's water, storms, and so on, with all sorts of citations. But I could certainly put together a list of the stuff I used today.
Great. Jenny has a comment about, there's a new study from University of Massachusetts that shows 61% of known invasive plants are still being sold. What can we do to address this problem, since removing invasives from our wild area and parklands is costing us many millions of dollars?
It's being addressed. I mean, there are laws being passed, I think most recently in Delaware and several states, I don't know if Florida does, but have prohibited the sale of noxious non-native plants. But it's not 50 states yet, but it is accelerating. And the cost, the bill for dealing with invasive plants is, I think, one of the things that's spurring those lists and those laws to be passed. The other thing is that with the pollinator crisis that we've been experiencing for the last few years, a lot of elected officials have gotten very interested in promoting pollinator health using native plants and on spending money to do so. So when we argue for states to copy, say, Delaware's list of prohibited species, we can argue that that will save money in invasive control costs, and also that it'll promote popular things like pollinator habitat restoration. The invasive species laws will be on the page that I hope will soon be up on our website of all of the state and local laws promoting native plants around the country. That will be included there. And you can also take a look at our periodic email newsletter, NPCC News. There's archives on our website. And if you search for invasives, that's a quick way of finding out which states have done it, because we report on it as it happens, as every state adopts a law prohibiting invasives. So there's a lot of information on there already while we wait for the law page to be finalized.
Great. Mike would like to know how much reduction in greenhouse gases do we get if all those lawnmowers are electric instead of gasoline?
Well, it kind of depends on where the electricity comes from. A lot, but a lot of electricity production also, of course, produces greenhouse gas emissions. So it's kind of hard to say. But that's certainly, I mean, part of the way that we're going to have to tackle this is getting more and more electric everything, instead of individual engines burning fossil fuel in the most wasteful possible way that anyone could think of in the history of the planet. And then also cleaning up the way we produce electricity so that it doesn't also exacerbate the problem with emissions, using things like solar. And also even just implementing simple conservation measures for power. But so, yeah, that would help. But then you don't get the benefits that go along with replanting with natives. But what Doug would say, and he does say all the time, and you've probably heard him, is that people don't have to replace their entire garden with natives. They just have to do as much as they can. Every little bit helps. And so yeah, finding a better way to power lawnmowers would be extremely helpful.
And
Lisa, let me just say one other thing.
Okay.
I think PowerPoint skipped over a slide about Las Vegas, which just this year has mandated the removal of what they're calling non-functional turf, mostly for water conservation purposes. So they're mandating the removal of turf grass that's not walked on, that serves no function other than being decorative. So that's roadsides, that's even common areas of condominium complexes and subdivisions, and they expect to save something like 86 million gallons of water a year with that measure. And they're supposed to remove the lawn. I mean, it's a real law that will have real world consequences soon. I think we're talking about by 2026 is the deadline. So, not way out into the future. And they're going to get rid of something between like 3,000 and 4,000 acres or square feet. A large quantity of the lawn, I think it's 30% of the lawn in Las Vegas, they've decided is, in Las Vegas County, they've decided is non-functional. So that's going to go by this deadline. And then you can also learn about that in NPCC News as well.
All righty. We have a observation here that our University of Florida IFAS Extension offices promote lawns and turf as beneficial ground cover, and their pollution, to filter pollutants, prevent runoff and erosion, cooling, cleaning the air, reduction of glare and noise. Do you expect there to be any alignment of opinion between the Native Plant Organization of the U.S. and UFIDs?
Okay, what was the organization? Oh, it was the Extension, University of Florida Extension.
Correct.
As these data come in, particularly the greenhouse data that more and more people, I mean, I think that was a University of Florida study that found that 11 acres was producing however many tons of carbon dioxide because of the breakdown of fertilizer and because of the emissions from cuttings and so on. So there are more and more studies showing that on a net basis, lawns perform worse and actually emit greenhouse gases versus other kinds of landscaping. And the people that have historically and traditionally promoted lawns as part of the toolbox for dealing with climate change, because of course they do sequester carbon, they photosynthesize. Most of those studies are just measure how much CO2 the lawn absorbs. Most of them don't do net inputs and outputs of greenhouse gases. So as more and more of these studies come out, I think that a lot of at least academic institutions are going to change their policies going forward. Now, obviously, with all of these things, the lawn industry, as with many of these issues, we've got a huge multi-billion-dollar industry in lawn care, not to mention turf production and so on, that are in the process of fighting back against these kinds of initiatives like I've described today. But as the extinction and climate crises continue to accelerate and tighten their grip, particularly climate crises, the data just aren't there. I mean, look at Las Vegas. They're mandating the removal of 30% of their turf. They wouldn't do it if they didn't see an emergency. So the evidence is so overwhelming that I do think there'll be a change, and more rapid possibly than we would normally expect, because climate change is becoming, it's just becoming so obvious to everybody what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's costing everybody so much money, and there's no water.
Okay. Just a couple of more minutes for questions, but Patrick wants to know, how can we move a law forward in Florida similar to the one in Maryland We had passed one on water use that prevents HOAs from requiring high water demanding turf, but the HOAs have found a way around that.
You know, I would have to know. Florida, I don't know what the way they found around it was. Your response would have to be tailored to that, to whatever their response was. But I know it's very, very hard to get things like this done in Florida in particular. And one way to do it, which has occurred to me, is to organize native-friendly HOA individuals, get an organization. In fact, there may already be one out there on the internet somewhere of HOA people who want to do native gardens that are banding together to try to promote it. I should say that just today, I ran across an article about another person who's standing up, this time to Kansas City, the government of Kansas City, who wants him to remove his pollinator garden and put it back into lawn. And this guy is an 80-year-old veteran who got too old to mow his lawn on the steep hill. And so he planted a pollinator garden. And he's very indignant about being told that he can't have it and that he has to go back to grass. And he's taken to social media and media. And people are rallying around him, as they are the woman in Maryland. So the best I can do is to get examples of this as possible and have people work together to fight back against, these old, outdated, science-free kinds of land management. Sorry, I can't do better.
All right. Thanks, Emily. I think we're going to end it here. If you didn't get your question answered during the session and you would like to ask Emily a question, please send it to info@flawildflowers.org. And I'd also like to remind you that this session was recorded, so look for it in about 24 hours on youtube.com/FLA-wildflowers. Thank you so much, Emily, for being our guest. We really appreciate it. We learned so much.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot too. And also it was nice to see progress being made in such a very, very bad area of environmental management. So thank you for the opportunity.